When the Daystar scandal broke regarding Jonathan Lamb's daughter and allegations of SA, one name many Christians expected to speak out was Joyce Meyer. Why? Because Joyce Meyer has long been a vocal advocate against SA, especially within families. Joyce herself has been open about her own painful experiences with SA, using her platform to address the issue and advocate for accountability and healing within the Christian community. Over the years, she has called out the importance of transparency and responsibility, especially when it comes to protecting the vulnerable.
Well, I was just very, very young when he started to put his hands on me and do different things. And but when I was a young teenager, it went beyond just putting his hands on me to just making me his mistress. Mm-hmm. And my mom caught him when I was a teenager. She came home unexpectedly and caught him. And
I'll never know what it's like to have a great dad. I'll never know what it's like to be able to sit on my dad's lap, put my arms around his neck, and just get a hug without fear that it's going to turn into something else. I'll never be able to be hurting and ask my dad to go have coffee with me and sit down and just tell him what I'm going through and have him really care. I'll never have that. And literally what he did was me. And he did it every week, at least once a week, until the time I was 18.
So, when such a scandal hit a prominent Christian family like the Lambs, founders of a ministry millions look to for spiritual guidance, it wasn't surprising that many turned their attention to Joyce. People wanted her to say something, to weigh in, and to hold the same standards she's preached for years, because her voice carries weight in matters like this, because she's not just a preacher, she's someone who's lived through the pain of SA and has used her story to push for real change. But sadly, Joyce Meyer has remained silent, and it's been business as usual in the church world. Meanwhile, social media comment sections are buzzing, with users tagging her repeatedly, urging her to speak out. The silence has raised eyebrows, but the reason might not be so hard to figure out. One of the recently released audio recordings by Julie Roys sheds some light on the matter. In the clip, Joni Lamb openly shares the names of those in her camp, people standing by her and supporting her decisions. As you may recall, Joni Lamb's marriage to Doug Weiss sent shockwaves through the Christian community, dividing opinions right down the middle. Some rallied behind her, supporting her decision to move forward, while others voiced disapproval, citing concerns about the circumstances surrounding the union. In the recording, Joni confidently lists individuals who supported her and encouraged her to move forward with the marriage. It's a show of solidarity, but it also hints at why figures like Joyce Meyer might be hesitant to speak out.
And there's a lot of other people like I didn't hear that are part of it, and I'm going to read their names, okay? So, and this was the 7th and 8th month we're talking about now, where I said, Lord, I can't. And he's like, I'm putting it back together. There were prophetic words from Hubie Sin. In fact, Hubie Sin told me, do not listen to your children. They are the worst people you can talk to right now. And she said, you've got to follow the Lord, et cetera, et cetera. People like, in fact, I wrote down all these names of the people. People like Drenda Cassie, who told me that the Lord's about to bring somebody into your life. This was July. He woke me up 3 days ago and said, the Lord said, don't close your heart and don't be afraid. People like Hubie Sin, people like my former assistant, Sam McNeil, who told me later, after she kind of knew, walking with me through this process, and she's like a little intercessor for me, and she told me, showed me an email that she had written back like in August, where the Lord had showed her that he would be the one, but she didn't show me till many months later. She showed me the date on it. People like Cheryl Pruitt-Salem, former Miss America, who upon hearing about us seeing each other, she said, I was praying and there's not anyone that I could have thought of that could better fit with you in your world than Doug. People like Cindy Murdoch, and they'll say, oh, well, she's my friend, she's on the table. But she's a friend that would wound me with truth, just like I have done with her over the years. And she would tell me if she didn't feel right about it. People like Cindy Johnson and Darius Johnson, who we've gone on 2-week trips with, where Darius had intense time with him for hours and hours to talk to him and ask him questions. A seasoned pastor who has discernment, who was one of Marcus's best friends, who would be more protective over me than anybody. People like Jimmy Evans that I talked to in July the first time, and then later in July people like Karen Evans that I talked to through this process. You all said the same thing. Just wait, because the kids aren't ready. And so if we didn't have kids, we would have been married sooner. but we've waited.
How soon do you think you'd have gotten married if you were?
It doesn't matter.
I'm just curious.
And so people like Rhonda Davis, that have a program on Daystar, been a friend over 30 years, pastors at church, who is one of the closest people to God that I know of, who has prayed and stood with me on through the whole journey. I've told her every detail of stuff they don't know, the kids don't know, I mean, good and bad, and has 100% felt. Robert and Debbie, who Robert told me that Doug is known for his integrity in Colorado Springs. We went and met with them. Joyce Meyer, who has called me on multiple occasions, multiple times, we talked about it. John Hagee, who went through a similar situation where he divorced his wife. He did not have adultery, but some of the same situation that Doug was in.
The ongoing issues between Jonathan Lamb and his mother, Joni Lamb, are deeply connected. At one point, Jonathan chose to set aside the SA situation involving his daughter for the sake of keeping the family business intact. But when Joni married Doug Weiss, everything changed. Jonathan was pressured to publicly support their union on TV by reading a card, but he refused, and not long after, he was fired. This marriage brought a lot of buried issues back to the surface, and now it's clear that anyone who supported Joni and Doug's union is struggling to hold Jonathan's daughter's SA case accountable in a public way. That's likely the position Joyce Meyer has found herself in. People who are waiting for her to speak out about this situation might be waiting forever, because it's just not going to happen.
My dad sexually abused me, and my mother knew it and didn't do anything about it, so she basically abandoned me to it out of fear. And let me tell you, I have spent my life dealing with stuff that he did to me. But when they got older, God asked me one morning when I was praying, he said, I want you to move your parents closer to where you live, buy them a little house, put them in it, and take care of them until they die. Well, I said, I rebuke you, Satan. I mean, I did. I thought there is no way that God would ask me to do that. But you know, when something is God, it'll come back around another time, and another time, and another time. That's one of the ways you can tell when you're hearing from God, is something just stays. It just stays. You think about it, then tomorrow you think about it again. Even if it's something as little as call somebody. Anyway, it's a long story short, but we did obey God, and I think it was probably one of the most powerful things against the kingdom of darkness that I ever did. There's nothing that defeats the devil more than when you're good to somebody who has not been good to you.
Joyce Meyer's story of surviving SA is undeniably heartbreaking and deeply moving. Her transparency has brought comfort and healing to many. However, there's a part of her message that raises serious concerns. The statement, "There's nothing that defeats the devil more than being good to someone who hasn't been good to you." While this sentiment might hold weight in certain situations, it has no place in the context of SA. God never intended for anyone, especially children, to endure harm, let alone feel obligated to extend kindness to those who violated them. Hearing this kind of statement in the context of SA can be deeply damaging, particularly for children who may already be grappling with misplaced guilt or responsibility for the sins of others. What about the children in her audience who are currently living through this nightmare? Hearing such a message might reinforce the dangerous belief that it's their job to rise above by caring for those who hurt them, rather than seeking protection, justice, and healing. This is not the burden God places on victims. It's the responsibility of the abusers to repent and face the consequences of their actions. That's what you call codependency, feeling like you'll be a better person for doing something good for the very person who stole your childhood. This kind of rhetoric, while dressed in the language of faith and virtue, is dangerous and places victims in harm's way. It's not biblical, and it certainly isn't godly. Instead, it perpetuates a cycle where victims feel responsible for the actions of their abusers and are pressured into silence under the guise of doing good or showing grace. If someone has committed SA, the most loving and just thing you can do for the victim and for society is to report the abuser and ensure they're held accountable. This isn't about vengeance, it's about protecting others from experiencing the same harm. Letting the police and authorities take over is not only the legal responsibility of those who know about such crimes, but also a moral one. Failing to act allows abusers to continue their predatory behavior unchecked. God never called victims, especially children, to bear the burden of forgiving or protecting their abusers. Forgiveness is deeply personal and never meant to shield predators or excuse their actions. Protecting or shielding abusers under the guise of forgiveness is exactly why so many people are walking away from the church. It sends the message that the victim's pain doesn't matter and that the abuser deserves grace they haven't even earned. It's just wrong to expect someone to forgive such a horrific, life-altering act without holding the abuser accountable. Forgiveness is about freeing yourself from the weight of anger, not about excusing evil or protecting someone who has caused so much harm. The church needs to stop confusing forgiveness with a pass for abusers, because that's not what God intended.